In a previous talk I did discussing the issue of medical mandates, I brought up the logical fallacy known as complexity bias, which, as you can probably figure, is a bias towards believing that the more complex view is the correct view, and that the simple answer is less likely to be true just because it's simple. So, this is a fallacy based on assumption. The assumption being that the more complex answer is probably the correct one or the more intelligent one, and that's often false. So, just like with the issue of medical mandates actually not being complicated at all on an ethical level, namely because individuals should be respected as such as human beings who own their own bodies and therefore can make their own medical choices, period. So, since that's actually very simple, and the idea that, well, in order for the collective good, we have to give up some individual liberty and, follow whatever the so called experts and authorities say and basically accept abuse. This is the crux of the communist viewpoint. It's basically deceiving people into accepting abuse. If you were to distill all of what we call, cultural Marxism, communism, that whole collectivist perspective is against the individual, but supposedly for society as a whole, right? That is the crux of the deception, that it's actually okay to abuse people in order to make the world overall a better place. So, this collectivism is founded on the view that all private property should be abolished, right? That was the fundamental idea, expressed by Karl Marx, right? That's the, you could say, bedrock of communist ideology, the destruction of private property, and instead everything basically being called public property, or more accurately, state property. So that's something to meditate on, right? No private property, okay? So if there's no private property, then that includes yourself, right? You can no longer really even consider your own body your own private property, right? And that's what these uh, medical tyrants and fascists want you to believe, that, you know what, actually the state should control your body. Your body should be considered public property, in the interest of the public good, right? This is their rationale. It's a fundamental to, again, it's fundamental to communist ideology. The very idea that the state can control your body is a communist idea. It's extreme communism. It's going beyond, seizing control of physical objects that are your property and going all the way to, the most sacred and fundamental form of private property, which is your own body. So they want you to view yourself as collective property. And this is actually supported by spiritual propaganda, wherein they go on and on about how we're all connected, or we're all one. So that might sound nice on the surface, but really it's an anti individual perspective, right? Because if we're all one, then that means that there are no actual individuals, right? We're just one collective, right? It's a collectivist viewpoint, being pushed, in the name of peace, love, and enlightenment, right? That this is the enlightened perspective to uh, disregard your own individuality and just see yourself as just this part of a greater whole. And again, it can sound on the surface like a nice thing, but it's actually very deceptive because we are actually individuals. And if we submit to this, or we accept this idea of there are no individuals, or that the idea of an individual should be rejected, that individualism is the same as selfishness and egoism and egomania, right? They want you to believe that seeing yourself as an individual is immoral and even delusional, if unenlightened, right? When the truth is actually we are individuals, and this idea that we are not, and that we're just all part of this so-called collective, that's actually the real delusion, especially when this so-called collective is thought to govern themselves, right? You have this idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, or the government of, by, and for the people, right? That we're all just ruling ourselves. There's not actually this group of people that are abusively controlling large populations. No, it's all just this big collective, right? That's the idea they want you to go for. In the book Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, there's a famous quote that's been recirculated as if it's actual wisdom, where he said, in the book he wrote, "Everyone belongs to everyone else." And, again, this is the we're all one, anti-individual perspective. And then this was mirrored recently by the World Economic Forum with their advertisement about how in coming years you'll own nothing and you'll be happy, right? So it's the same idea, a collectivist idea, right? You'll own nothing, you'll have no private property, including your own body, but you'll be happy, right? Inequality will finally be overcome. All the evils of capitalism will be destroyed in this collectivist utopia. And as I said, this is just fundamental to communist ideology. It's one of the planks or pillars of the Communist Manifesto, the abolition of private property, and that goes with the abolition of inheritance, right? Inheritance is seen as an evil, and the promotion of state asset forfeiture, right? This is right out of the Communist Manifesto, and it can seem like a good idea, right? You can see like, oh well, there's people in severe poverty who don't even have the basics of survival, while other people are, materially very wealthy, and this doesn't seem right. And so wanting to remedy that, is a good instinct, right? So communism, Marxism relies on actually deceiving people by playing off of their instinct of compassion, you could say. The deception is getting folks to believe that this whole program of socialism and communism is the means of achieving that. And I'm not saying that what we would call like the right wing or conservative political stance is actually the solution. As I said in part one, it's actually statism as a whole that is the flawed viewpoint, and both sides have been deceived into thinking that the actual solution is bad, right? Neither communists or conservatives uh, think anarchism or personal sovereignty is a good idea. They both oppose that. So they're they're both forms of statism. It's just that the communism is the extreme of it, so it's more clear in how mistaken it is and how destructive it is. The conservatives, like the right wing conservatism, is less statist, right? It's less for extreme power given to the state, and so it's, you could say, more correct, but it's still incorrect in that it's not actually supporting the real solution, which is getting down to fundamental ethics and individual liberty. The idea that some state power is legitimate is actually the fundamental blunder, and that blunder is just the basis for increasing state power, right? This idea that you can like keep a state small, give a group of people this uh, free pass on being abusive, right? On committing extortion and yeah, having a monopoly on violence. That somehow is going to be self-regulated or contained by law, or by voting. That's actually just not based in reality. That's not how it goes, as we can see. Case in point would be the United States in the year 1913. What went on in that year is interesting. You might call it a Marxist coup that was never, that isn't widely recognized as such, wherein the 16th Amendment was put into place, which installed the income tax, which again is right out of the Communist Manifesto. That is a plank or pillar of communist ideology. It's right in there, written by Marx and Engels. Income tax, key for establishing a communist state. And, this returns to, it's just another attack on personal liberty and private property, right? Because your income tax is a tax on your labor, right? So now, the percentage was much smaller back in 1913, but now it's somewhere around like 30%, I believe, is the average of, the percent of your life force, you could say, your energy or labor that's taken by the state right out of your paycheck, which equates to about 4 months out of every year being taken, and you could say involuntary servitude. Your private, what's more private again than your own body and, your own life force, right? And this is just being taken without consent. So you have 4 months out of the year, labor going to the state, which would add up to about 15 years of your life, over so many decades, an average career span. And and taxation is used as a form of like psychological intimidation as well. It's made purposely complex, right? Like you read your tax form and it's like incomprehensible. Like it's written in a way that you need to ask, right, an expert. Well, what does this mean exactly? What does this statement mean in plain English, right? What should I put into this space? And it's made in a way where you can easily make a mistake, right? Because it's not clear what they're asking. And if you go to two different tax specialists, accountants, you can get actually different answers as to what the correct thing to do is from two equally qualified, certified, whatever experts, right? So even among the experts, there's disagreement. So, and that's not by mistake, right? It's done that way so that you're put in a position of, um, like I said, being intimidated, right? Because it's like, well, if I make a mistake here, they can audit me, and ultimately they can end up arresting me and putting me in prison, right? So they make it overly complicated, you know, with the writing on your forms that you gotta, fill out at work and so on. But then, of course, the tax code itself is, just this huge, incomprehensible mess, right? It's made that way on purpose so that it can serve as a form of actually terrorizing the population into obedience, right? Because people have heard about what happens when someone is audited or whatever. Again, this threat of arrest and imprisonment hangs in the background, and so ultimately, the state interaction with the population through the main interaction people have with the state is filling out tax forms, which is made to be this basically intimidating and purposely convoluted process or unintelligible process wherein, yeah, you could easily uh, make a mistake, which would then, be labeled criminal. So works for communists to institute a heavy income tax as it's worded exactly in the Communist Manifesto, along with a quote national bank monopoly, or what we call a central bank, the United States, known as the Federal Reserve System. And that was also brought into being in the year 1913. So we have the income tax and the central bank, two planks or pillars of the Communist Manifesto, brought into place in the same year. Interesting, right? So another plank or pillar that you can find in the Communist Manifesto is the emphasis on state education. Free education. Of course, it's not free. That's what your taxes go toward. And the reason why this is so fundamental to establishing a communist society is because it's a place of indoctrination for accepting the collectivist viewpoint. And it's been rightly assessed that public schools are actually literal prisons. They're what you could call day prisons, or low security re-education centers, right? Where if you don't go, if the student does not go, if the child does not go, they are labeled a truant. We have the truant officers to basically hunt them down. And then the student and the family of the parents of the child are made out to be criminals, and if they don't comply with staying within the day prison during the allotted hours, then they can be subject to being put into a more high security prison, or a 24-hour prison, right? So again, the threat of violence is behind all of this. Like I said in part one, the fundamental ideology is one of just wanting to control and abuse. That's really what they're all about. They'll say it's for the purpose of social justice, or for equality, equity, fairness and utopia, right? But that's a deception, and all they really want is just to gain more control over people so that they can then abuse them, right? It's like I was saying, fundamentally, satanic in that way. It's just an ideology of abuse. And they slander those that um, oppose them, and they make them out to be the violent ones. So a great example, or really clear example of this in recent times is um, these socialists, Marxists, communists going against the Gadsden flag with the image of the rattlesnake and the statement, "Don't tread on me." And they'll say, "Oh, well, that's a symbol of white supremacy and racism and violence," and so they just stick to their standard tactic of slander, which I'll get into in a little more about how that's not just my opinion, but like actually in the writings of Marxists and communists, that they openly state that slander is key for their revolution. But yeah, back to the Gadsden flag. So they make that out to be an evil thing, right? When the statement itself, "Don't tread on me," is simply saying, don't violate my rights, don't commit aggression against me, right? The rattlesnake is not an aggressive creature. It gives you a warning saying, hey, don't harm me, leave me alone and I'll leave you alone, which is just basic ethics, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's saying, don't abuse me, right? But that's the thing. These communists, they want you to accept the idea that receiving abuse is actually a good thing. You're virtuous if you accept this whole system of abuse and accept that you're not actually an individual, and accept that you're just part of this collective that should just be under constant abuse in the form of slavery, basically. So yeah, they attack the Gadsden flag, even though that really is a great flag. It's a great statement because it just cuts right to the core of it gets right to the core ethics that opposes this abusive communist statist perspective and agenda. So, like I was saying about slander being their go-to, um, I got a couple quotes here. This one from Marx himself said, "Accuse your enemy of what you're doing as you're doing it to create confusion." So, not only does that point out the use of slander, but also the use of promoting confusion, like I was saying from the start, by making things overly complex. The simple truth is avoided and lost. And the folks that embrace this ideology, they really hate truth. Actually, that's there in the writings of Marx and Engels too, this anti-truth, anti-morality. They don't want you to understand simple truth, simple ethics, right? They want you to just accept this gobbledygook of collectivism, collectivist morality, and even though it isn't supported by common sense or history, they want you to just go along with it, and they want to just ridicule and shame you if you disagree and try and intimidate you into going along with it, right? So it's intimidation via threats of violence, as I previously mentioned, but then there's also the intimidation via ridicule and shaming. And as I mentioned in part one, I believe, the root of the word devil, the Greek for the word devil is diabolos, in Spanish, diablo. And so, yeah, the Greek means slanderer. Like, that is the fundamental meaning of the word. And to slander, if you're not familiar with the definition of slander, it's to give false statements injurious to a person's reputation, false, malicious statements or reports, right? And that's what they're all about. Like I mentioned with them accusing the libertarian perspective, or the anarchist perspective against rulers as actually the evil, right, that needs to be overcome. They're just accusing the enemy of what they're actually doing, as Marx himself encouraged them to do. And then, in more recent years, there's the author of Rules for Radicals, Saul Alinsky, who many have pointed out is basically, the inspiration behind, modern progressivism, or, what is now, become of the Democratic Party, modern Marxism or neo-Marxism, whatever you want to call it, cultural Marxism, statism. Saul Alinsky wrote, "Ridicule is man's most potent weapon." So again, encouraging slander, and slander being fundamentally associated with the devil, evil, right? So, as I mentioned in part 1, 2, it's important to recognize like what they're actually slandering, right? They're slandering those that are pro-freedom, pro-individual rights, right? Because they want everyone to be enslaved by this collectivist mindset. And it's actually, the same mistake, the same blunder, but just to different degrees on both the conservative and the liberal or leftist side. Both sides slander sovereign individuals. Both sides slander and oppose the idea of individuals having their own sovereign territory. But the interesting thing to note is that this is exactly what the powers that be want for themselves, right? They consider themselves sovereign, right? Rulers of states consider each of the states sovereign from one another, right? They're very much about enforcing their borders, right? And recognizing, well, I'm a sovereign, this is a sovereign country, and you can't violate my airspace and so on, right? So they're very much about sovereignty for themselves, right? But not for you, right? If you start talking about sovereignty for yourself, oh, well, now you're a wacko, domestic terrorist, right? So that's how that works. Both communists and conservatives have been programmed to reject real morality and the real solution of anarchism, along with veganism, on both sides. A lot of times I think conservatives think that like veganism is part of like this communist agenda or this new world order agenda. But if you look carefully, that doesn't actually hold up, and it's more the regulation, or I should say, destruction of natural food and replacing it with genetically modified food, which is owned by corporations working with the state. It's really pushing GMOs, which is what they're after. And sadly, though, a lot of conservatives think GMOs are just fine. So, what would actually be the ethical thing to just leave animals alone, which is what veganism basically is, just saying, well, I'm not going to be aggressive towards animals for no good reason. And that's basically what anarchism is, just towards humans. Well, I'm just going to leave humans alone. I'm not going to try and rule over, dominate, exploit, enslave, murder humans. It's the same. Anarchism is just nonviolence towards people, and veganism is just nonviolence towards animals. But they don't want you to get that simple truth, so they've managed to deceive both sides into being against both. And just to be more clear on how actually the so-called woke, Marxist socialists aren't really about veganism. It's more the anarchists that you'll find that perspective, because the combination of both they call veganarchism, and that's a recognition of the united principle. It's the same principle, just like I said, applied towards animals or towards humans. Anarchism is saying humans are not the livestock of other humans, and veganism is just saying, well, we shouldn't treat animals as property either, and we should respect that they want to live and that they feel pain and have emotions, and that we can, get our nutrients elsewhere, right? But yeah, so with the socialist kind of minded folks, they'll actually attack a veganism from again, like a so-called social justice perspective, where they'll usually cite, well, like, oh, that's racist. They'll call veganism racist because it's disregarding, cultural traditions, even though eating animals, enslaving animals is part of every tradition. Every ethnicity has been participating in that. It's not like you can just isolate one ethnicity as, being abusive towards animals. It's been everybody deceived by, I'd say, the enemy into believing that abusing animals is just fine. Yeah, and again, conservatives, that should be like that should ring a bell. Once these folks start calling something racist that doesn't seem to have any real connection to racism, right? Then you should make the connection that it's just the same ideology, the same slander to support the same program, namely communism, namely statism. So yeah, these the commies slander vegans just like they slander anarchists, although they'll try and confuse you with thinking that anarchism and communism are one of the same. If they're like, they'll come up with terms like anarcho communism, and a lot of times they'll be promoting socialism, promoting communism, but they'll just call it anarchism, even though it's clearly what they're talking about is, again, like straight out of the Communist Manifesto, but they'll just throw the label anarchism on it. When again, anarchism is the complete other end of the spectrum. It's against a ruling class altogether, and communism is about empowering the ruling class even more, becoming a slave to the ruling class even more. And they'll say, oh, well, again, it's just temporary, or it's not really being ruled by the ruling class, because they're just a phase to this utopia. They'll give up their power. Again, it's very similar to the conservative viewpoint. Actually, they think that, well, we have to give some group of people this power in order to establish freedom for all. So it's really just two sides of the same coin. That coin being statism. Oh, and I forgot to mention on the Gadsden flag. I actually saw an image where some leftist group like recreated or distorted the Gadsden flag and changed it to say "We will tread." And so that's great in that it's more out in the open, just them stating what their fundamental view is and their ethics are, which is that aggression is a-okay, right? Their view is the opposite of the non-aggression principle, right? Libertarianism, or Libertarian Anarchy, which is the title of a book by Gerard Casey I recommend. Um, the non-aggression principle is the opposite of their viewpoint, of their ideology, right? We will tread. They tread meaning, aggress against. So they embrace violence, but yet say that they're somehow, making the world a better place, or, maybe they think that, well, the ends justify the means, right? Again, they hate fundamental truth and ethics. They hate the prime example of that, I would say, being, the greatest commandments given by Jesus, which is a law of comprehensive love with no exceptions, right? He didn't say, we should love God, others, and ourselves, unless we need to install a communist regime to establish equality, right? No, he never said that, because that's just a deception, like I've been saying. So they're against truth, they're against morality. They're also against beauty, and that's why another like aspect of the divine That's why you'll notice oftentimes with these folks, they seem to embrace ugliness, right? Like, um, especially on the feminine side, they seem to have a strong distaste for like feminine beauty, and they want to distort it. Which just goes along with the divide and conquer strategy with the gender war, like I was saying in part one. Because if you destroy the natural design of men and women, you destroy the harmony between the two, and that destroys family. And destruction of the family is another fundamental uh, tactic or goal of communism, right? So that's why the whole gender dysphoria made out to be like a social justice movement, and same with transgenderism. It's all just about fundamentally attacking the family because it's fun. It's destroying the key, the foundation of the family, which is a man and a woman, distinct from one another, equal but different. Different roles, different strengths, but complementary and harmonious and attractive to one another when each are in their correct polarity, correct design. They're all about destroying that because again it then destroys the possibility of a harmonious family, which is the goal of Marxism. And again, the reason for that is because it increases state power, right? If families are destroyed, well, then that foundation, that right foundation of a society, individuals and individual families in voluntary relation with one another, following their natural good design, right? It's all against that. It's all against that natural order. So that out of that disharmony, the state can then come in as the supposed or so-called savior of humanity. Out of chaos, order, right? That's their motto. And that order is just a system of global control and abuse, right? They just want to enslave humanity because they're possessed control freaks. But those at the top of the pyramid, of course, can't just be out in the open about it. So, the education system is, again, key, because if they can indoctrinate the youth to think that being enslaved to the state is actually freedom, right? And that those that are promoting what you'd call traditional values or, sound morality, namely, what we could call Christian morality, but I'm hesitant to even use the word Christian because of the domination of the Pauline Christian church, the Pauline dogma, which is actually opposed to what Jesus taught. So I would just say, again, specifically the greatest commandments of Jesus, they're not wanting folks to really embrace that. So yeah, they've distorted the whole, they hijacked and distorted the ministry of Jesus to make it out to be this mess of inherited sin and outright statist perspective, where Paul said all governments are basically installed by God, and obeying governments is equivalent to obeying God. He said also that slaves should obey their slave master no matter how abusive they are, because that's God's will. Right? That's just complete garbage. That's just satanic propaganda that unfortunately a lot of people have swallowed because they don't understand that propaganda works by mixing truth with lies. So they keep focusing on, oh, well, Paul said these nice things, so I'm just going to ignore this, satanic garbage that completely opposes Jesus, that promotes statism and slavery. I'm just going to ignore that. And also promotes self-hatred and shame by believing that you inherited sin. and that you're inherently wicked, that your heart is inherently wicked, which also serves state power, right? Because if everyone is inherently wicked, as Paul taught, not Jesus, by the way, if you're unfamiliar with Christianity and what Jesus actually taught, you might be surprised to hear Jesus didn't actually teach inherited sin and teach that your heart is inherently wicked. That was Paul. Paul from the Roman Empire, who supposedly, had a conversion experience and went from bounty hunter for the empire to apostle. But if you'd like to learn more about him, I have a whole playlist that you can watch along with the articles explaining how his teachings are extremely toxic and again against what Jesus actually taught. So yeah, propaganda, miseducation is key, so that people think that the good is evil and the evil is good. And I mentioned Brave New World in this talk, and in part one I mentioned Orwell's 1984, and we have the term Orwellian to describe speech or statements or beliefs that are completely backwards. Freedom is slavery, slavery is freedom. And that's exactly what they've managed to get people to believe, that being enslaved to the state is actually the means to freedom. That's why they are so adamant and passionate, right? They think that they're fighting the good fight, and meanwhile they're just a tool of the devil. And on both sides, there's oftentimes this discussion of freedom and security, especially in academia. Pretty much it seems like every college professor will talk about, the balance between freedom and security, as if it's this, very nuanced and complex area, when in fact it's not complicated at all. Again, it's this confusion and overcomplication of something that isn't complicated at all. So, I've heard ethics professors, go on about, again, this needed balance between the two. And it's always kind of like left, up in the air as to like, well, we're just trying to figure it out as best we can. It's just going to be this continuous back and forth between freedom and security. And, hopefully we'll pretty much stay in this kind of like middle of the road, not go too far one way or the other. And like, that's the mainstream view, and they think that's like intelligent, but it's stupid, because they're not actually they don't actually need to be considered opposed to one another. Freedom is rarely understood to mean freedom to do anything other than abuse, and also the freedom from receiving any abuse, right? So you're free to do anything except abuse. Sometimes people say, you're free to do anything except harm someone else or violate their rights. But more specifically, exactly, we could say free to do anything other than abuse. And then it's also about freedom from being abused, right? So freedom from being abused is the same thing as security, right? If you're secure, that means you're not being abused. So security is just a form of freedom. It is freedom. It's freedom from abuse. So there's really no conflict between freedom and security when the non-abuse or the non-aggression principle is included in the evaluation, as it should be. So that clears that up. You can save yourself going to all these college courses on ethics and politics that talk about the supposedly complicated issue of freedom and security. And it's really about mind control. Like I said in part one, even the word government basically, can be reduced to the meanings of control of the mind. And Edward Bernays, who is called, like, I think he's been given the label like godfather of public relations propaganda, and so he wrote that main elements of public relations, i.e. propaganda, are informing people, persuading people, and integrating people with people. And I read a good article, I believe it was by John Rappaport, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, where he was analyzing that, and he said, integrating people with people. In other words, to make mind control propaganda work, people must cease thinking of themselves as independent individuals. That's the key. They must think of themselves first and foremost as part of a group. Then the propaganda works beautifully, end quote. I'll continue this quote of Mr. Rappaport, and I'll link to his blog as well so that you can read more of his writing, or I'll try and link to this particular article if I can find the link. So he goes on to say, quote, therefore, the first order of business for propaganda is launching suggestion after suggestion that, quote, we're all together, end quote. This, quote, meta-suggestion, end quote, must appear to be made with the greatest sincerity and concern for the general good, end quote. So this ties into what I was saying earlier about pushing the we're all one, collectivist mindset is really fundamental, right? Because you could say, well, the abolition of private property is fundamental, but in other words, the promotion of collectivism, right? If there's no private property, everything is collective property. We're all together, right? So that's the meta suggestion. Again, as he said, given in the vehicle or Trojan horse of, greatest concern for the general good, So again, this is a key fundamental aspect of the ideology to understand, is that it's about convincing people that individual liberty, the individual's right to not be abused must be discarded. And that's just the fundamental blunder that they've managed to deceive people into accepting, along with rejecting just creation as a whole, intelligent design, differences between men and women, the beauty of both as they were designed, and the beauty of nature, and the beauty that could exist in a free society, right? It's just it's an attack on creation, right? Because the devil, Satan, the word Satan means actually the adversary, or the adversary of the creator. So that's why all of this is adversarial to the natural order, to creation. Even though those folks that are actually supporting it and promoting it may not even realize that that's what they're doing, that they're actually, like I said, tools of the devil. They might just think they're tools of the, so-called revolution, right? That they're actually bringing about social justice, right? That's the deception that they've been led to believe, mainly through schooling. I have another good quote here from an article on neo-Marxism, cultural Marxism, that I'll link to below as well. So it's talking about cultural hegemony, or cultural collectivism, and it was saying that this concept, or one person was saying that this concept was basically created by a man named Antonio Gramsci. And they said, quote, Gramsci theorized that if communism achieved mastery of human consciousness, then active revolution would be unnecessary. Mastery over the consciousness of the great mass of people could be attained if communists or their sympathizers gained control of the organs of culture: churches, education, newspapers, magazines, the electronic media, literature, music, the visual arts, and so on. By winning cultural hegemony, communism would control the deepest wellsprings of human thought and imagination. one need not control all information itself if one can gain control over the minds that assimilate that information. In 1967, the West German student movement leader Rudi Dutschke reformulated Gramsci's philosophy of cultural Marxism with the phrase, quote, "the long march through the institutions of the nation and the state, the church, entertainment, civil service, educational faculties, family institutions, and marriage to replace the dominant culture." And then, again, referring to Saul Alinsky, one influential figure in the 60s who understood this theory was the radical Chicago activist and Marxist ideologue Saul Alinsky, had the plan to carry out the transformation of society through community organizers preying on the malcontents of society, right? So then we have, the recent BLM movement by folks who admitted that they were trained Marxist, and fitting into this, preying on the malcontents of society, right? They direct their program at people that are in fact suffering from injustice, and then say, "Oh, we got the solution for you," and it's to give the state more power. The way to do this, continuing with the article, quote, "the way to do this was through people's organizations composed largely of discontented individuals who believed society was fundamentally unjust and who would take their lead from trained community organizers. These organizers, taught Alinsky, should rub raw the resentments of the people and agitate to the point of conflict. His Handbook of Sedition Rules for Radicals was highly influential over the Democratic Party and is a textbook assiduously followed by left-wing activists." This subject of cultural Marxism can't be explained in full without reference to the Frankfurt School, critical theory, or postmodernism, all of which relate to cultural manipulation and are making a comeback today with critical race theory. So just to conclude and return to the main point, which is that statism, most obviously through what we would call Marxism and communism, is fundamentally satanic. More could be said about that, and there are other books besides the one I mentioned previously, The Devil and Karl Marx. There's one called, I believe, Marx and Satan, and it's a topic that has been discussed at length by others who mentioned, by the way, that Marx wrote poetry wherein he's speaking to the devil in, you could say, in a way showing his allegiance to him. And I'm sure many would just discount that as, "Oh, well, it's just poetry." Okay, well, it's worth noting anyway that he wrote satanic poetry. Also worth noting is that Saul Alinsky said things like, folks in hell are his kind of people. Again, you could say, "Oh, well, that's out of context. He didn't really mean that." Okay. I'm not making that my main point, but it's worth noting that, these leaders of the Marxist ideology, which just happens to fit Satanism to a T, also openly expressed sympathy for Satan and the devil and hell. And okay, I think that's noteworthy. If you don't, whatever. But to, include something else along the lines of showing the connection between Satanism and communism, like I mentioned previously in part one, Darwinism is actually a big part of it. Again, because it's an adversarial position to the Judeo-Christian view of the Creator. And I found a good quote that sums up a lot of the satanic side of it and how it relates to other aspects of what we call, the Marxist agenda. So, quote, "In promoting the idea that humans were merely animals and accidents of nature, the natural consequence of Darwinism was to overturn the traditional Judeo-Christian values of the sacredness of human life. The legacy of Darwin's theory can be seen in the rise of eugenics, euthanasia, racism, infanticide, and abortion, end quote. And like I was saying, the wickedness of that idea of believing that humans are inherently wicked definitely serves the communist viewpoint, right? Because communism is about treating people as livestock that need to be managed and controlled and abused, kept in place, uh, which isn't just a view, again, from the left. That's actually something held by statists on both sides, conservative or liberal, leftist. They think humans need that some abuse by so-called authorities is legitimate, and that even God uh, promotes or endorses this management, right, because of our fundamental wickedness, right? So that's key. That's a key meta suggestion for humanity to accept in order for them to then accept this domination by the state, otherwise known as communism, or more completely encompassing both left and right sides of the same coin, statism. Statism is Satanism, actually, when you boil it down, when you distill it to the essence. All right, I hope you found some of this insightful and helpful. Thanks for listening.